The moment began with a scene that could have been pulled straight from a movie, except it was real, raw, and happening in front of dozens of stunned onlookers. The billionaire, an imposing figure with a presence that seemed to command the very air around him, was in a state of uncontainable fury. Every step he took echoed across the marble floors of the luxury condominium lobby, each one a punctuation mark to the storm brewing inside him. His tailored suit, perfect just moments before, now appeared almost rigid, as if the tension in his body had stiffened the fabric itself. There was no mistaking the kind of anger he carried. It wasn't mild irritation or the fleeting frustration of someone inconvenienced. This was a firestorm, a volcanic eruption of outrage aimed squarely at the people and systems that, in his eyes, had failed him. He moved with a precision that suggested he was used to being obeyed, to being the one who decided the pace and direction of every situation he entered. But now, something had pierced his usual control. Something had ignited a spark that no amount of wealth, influence, or authority could immediately contain. His face was a canvas of emotion, brows knitted tightly, eyes blazing with an intensity that seemed almost physical, lips pressed into a thin, hard line that refused to soften. The muscles in his jaw twitched subtly, betraying the effort it took to maintain some semblance of composure. But it was clear that the composure was a veneer, a fragile mask threatening to crack at any second. As he moved toward the exit, it wasn't just a walk, it was a statement. Each step carried a message. I am done. I will not tolerate this. I will leave, and nothing you do can stop me. People nearby instinctively stepped aside, giving him space, almost as if instinctively acknowledging the storm contained within him. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Phones were forgotten in hands. Eyes followed him with a mix of fascination and fear, because anger on this scale carries its own gravity, a force that makes even strangers feel the pull of its intensity. Observers couldn't help but notice the subtle details that revealed just how far his anger had traveled beneath the surface. His hands, usually relaxed at his sides, were now clenched into fists, knuckles white with tension. Every finger seemed to grip the invisible frustration he carried, as if holding on too tightly might somehow anchor him to this reality. His shoulders, broad and usually relaxed, were hunched slightly forward, a posture that radiated aggression and a readiness for confrontation. It was clear that he was a man who did not explode easily, but when he did, the impact was undeniable. The cause of his fury was almost secondary to the display of it. Whether it was a disagreement with the management, a perceived slight from the staff, or some failure in the service he had come to expect, it didn't matter. What mattered was the expression of the outrage itself, the way it filled the room and left everyone else in a state of anxious anticipation. People around him whispered, tried to interpret the storm, wondering what exactly had pushed him to the brink. Each speculation only heightened the tension because the unknown was more terrifying than the known. Even as he approached the exit, there was a rhythm to his anger, a kind of theatrical cadence that drew attention and compelled focus. It was as if every inch he covered in those polished hallways was measured, deliberate, meant to communicate not just his displeasure, but the seriousness with which he carried it. The security personnel nearby exchanged uneasy glances, knowing that handling this level of anger required more than just protocol. The staff who had witnessed him before described it as a rare but unmistakable shift. The billionaire had moved from controlled authority to the raw, exposed energy of someone whose patience had reached absolute zero. The environment seemed to respond to his mood. The usual hum of conversation and the subtle background music faded into nothingness, as if the room itself had collectively acknowledged the magnitude of his emotion. It wasn't just anger, it was an atmosphere, a tangible weight pressing down on the people who had inadvertently become spectators in this personal drama. Time itself seemed to slow around him, each movement magnified, each step toward the exit resonating with the force of inevitability. And yet, amid all this chaos, there was a strange sort of rhythm, almost a dance of fury and anticipation. People could feel it, a tension so thick it was almost visible, hanging in the air, pressing against the walls, making it hard to breathe. The billionaire's fury was not just directed outward. It seemed to demand acknowledgement, a silent insistence that the world recognized the enormity of his dissatisfaction. His presence dominated the space, transforming the mundane luxury lobby into a stage for an emotional spectacle that none present would forget. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, like a heavy fog pressing down on everyone's shoulders, making each breath shallow and labored. The moment the billionaire stormed toward the exit, it wasn't just his anger that filled the air. It was the way it spread, a ripple of anxiety that touched everyone present, from the polished receptionist behind the front desk to the residents who had been idly chatting in the lounge. Conversations died mid-word, and a kind of frozen silence settled over the space, punctuated only by the billionaire's harsh footsteps, each one announcing the gravity of the situation. People shifted uneasily, glancing at each other for reassurance, hoping for some invisible cue that would tell them how to respond, how to survive the storm that had suddenly taken over their once calm environment. Eyes darted across the lobby, scanning for clues, for a hint of what might trigger the next eruption or, conversely, what might soothe it. Every small sound, the faint hum of the air conditioning, the clink of a coffee cup from the cafe corner, the distant elevator ding, suddenly seemed amplified, each one a potential spark in an already charged atmosphere. The body language of those present betrayed their discomfort, shoulders hunched, hands gripping phones or handbags, feet tapping nervously against the floor. Even the usually unflappable security guards were tense, standing rigid, scanning the billionaire for signs that he might turn violent or demand immediate action. People held their breaths not just in fear, but in anticipation. The kind of anticipation that makes time slow down, that stretches each second into an eternity. It was as though everyone in that room had been drawn into the gravitational pull of his fury, orbiting around the explosive energy radiating from him and waiting to see how it would manifest. Would he lash out verbally, hurling insults that would sting and humiliate? Would he slam doors or throw objects, his frustration demanding a physical outlet? Or would he simply walk away, leaving a trail of shaken staff and unsettled residents in his wake? The uncertainty created its own form of anxiety, one that spread silently but insistently, crawling into every corner of the space and settling into the minds of all who bore witness. Even those who tried to act normal found it impossible. Small, seemingly insignificant gestures, the bartender polishing glasses, the concierge adjusting papers on the desk, became tense, exaggerated performances of calm that betrayed the actor's inner turmoil. Everyone's attention was anchored to him, the billionaire, whose every twitch and flinch, every shifting glance, and every grunt of frustration carried disproportionate weight. Ordinary actions that would normally go unnoticed now seemed like potential triggers, as if the wrong move could tip the situation from controlled chaos into full-blown confrontation. There was a strange collective understanding among the people present, an unspoken agreement that this was not a moment to intervene directly, not yet. To approach him, to speak, even to look him in the eye, felt risky, almost forbidden. And yet, in that space, the tension wasn't entirely passive. It pulsed, moved, and almost had a shape of its own, pressing on the walls, filling the air, wrapping itself around every person in the room. You could feel it as a physical weight in your chest, a nervous energy that made fingers twitch and stomachs churn. It was not just the billionaire's fury. It was the effect of that fury on everyone else, a chain reaction that magnified the original anger exponentially. People's imaginations began to run wild. What had caused him to become so irate? Had there been a mistake in billing, a broken appliance, a slight he perceived from a resident or staff member? Speculation spread quietly, whispered from ear to ear, a nervous attempt to rationalize the irrational intensity of the moment. But the guesses only added to the tension, because the unknown is always more dangerous than the known. Each theory carried with it a sense of impending doom, as though the next step, the next word, The next gesture might ignite the full fury of a man who was clearly used to getting his way in every corner of his life. Even as the billionaire moved closer to the exit, the room seemed to hold itself still. No one dared to break the spell, to make a sound louder than a whisper, to move faster than a careful, calculated step. The tension had become almost tactile, like a tightrope stretched over a chasm, with everyone precariously balancing, knowing that a single misstep could result in disaster. In some ways, the building itself seemed to respond. The elevators paused in their ascent. The air conditioning seemed to hum more quietly. The reflective marble of the floor became a mirror of the frozen expressions above it. Everything, in a sense, existed only to amplify the tension, to magnify the presence of the angry figure whose wrath had commandeered the space completely. Even the residents, who had seen rich and temperamental people before, felt the difference here. This was not ordinary anger. It was volcanic. It was a kind of concentrated force that left no room for casual dismissal or polite negotiation. People instinctively stepped aside, creating paths and barriers without consciously deciding to do so. There was an acknowledgement, implicit but powerful, that the energy in the room was too dangerous to challenge directly. It demanded observation, attention, and careful patience. Amid the storm of tension in the lobby, there was one figure who moved almost unnoticed. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't wealthy, and he certainly wasn't someone anyone expected to influence the unfolding drama. He was the janitor, a man whose job was usually invisible, whose presence was only acknowledged when something needed cleaning, fixing, or moving. But now, as the billionaire's anger radiated outward like heat from a furnace, this janitor calmly continued his work, sweeping the corners of the lobby with slow, deliberate movements, each sweep of the broom a quiet defiance of the chaos swirling around him. His uniform was simple, unassuming, and perfectly ordinary, a stark contrast to the designer suits, polished shoes, and tense body language of the people who were frozen by the billionaire's fury. Yet in that contrast lay a certain power, the power of someone who was grounded, unshakable, and completely unaware of how significant his role might soon become. He moved with a kind of rhythm that suggested years of practice, each motion practiced, precise, almost meditative. The clatter of the broom against the marble floor was subtle but constant, a soft counterpoint to the thudding footsteps of the furious man. It was as if he had carved out a small bubble of calm within the chaos, an invisible shield that separated him from the rising storm. People around him barely noticed at first. Their attention was glued to the billionaire, whose every movement demanded focus. And that was the beauty of the janitor's presence. He did not try to compete for attention, he did not try to assert control, and he certainly did not act out of fear. He simply existed, quietly, deliberately, and with complete composure. His eyes, dark and steady, scanned the lobby almost absent-mindedly, but there was a sense that he was aware of everything. He noticed the slight twitch of a security guard's hand, the shifting posture of a receptionist, the subtle exhale of a resident holding back panic. But he did not react to these cues. Instead, he continued his work as though the world outside his immediate task did not exist. There was a confidence in this kind of calm, a self-assuredness that only comes from knowing your place in the world and understanding what you can control, and, more importantly, what you cannot. As the billionaire approached the exit, the janitor's presence became more noticeable, but not because he made it so. It was because the contrast between the two men was now impossible to ignore. On one side, a man whose rage filled every corner, every sound, every breath in the lobby, a storm that demanded attention. On the other, someone who moved through that storm like a grounded island in a sea of chaos, unaffected by the pressure, almost as if he were a calm observer of a play in which he had no lines. Yet somehow, the very act of being present, of existing quietly, was starting to shift the energy in the room. People began to notice small things, the deliberate movements of the janitor's hands, the calm focus in his gaze, the way he didn't flinch or react to the billionaire's loud commands or sharp words. He seemed almost untouchable, a figure who operated outside the usual rules of hierarchy and power that governed the lobby. There was a subtle authority in his quiet confidence, a kind of invisible gravity that began to pull attention in a different direction, even if no one could yet articulate why. It wasn't just that he was calm, it was the nature of his calm. It was not the brittle, forced calm of someone trying to hide fear. It was not the careful politeness of someone trained to follow rules. It was a deep, steady, rooted calm, the kind that comes from experience and self-possession. He knew he could do his job. He knew he could maintain his dignity, and he knew that there was a place for him in the unfolding events, even if others did not yet see it. As he worked, he occasionally glanced toward the billionaire, but not with fear, not with challenge. There was a neutrality in his glance, a simple recognition of the man's presence, as if to say, "I see you. I know what you are feeling, but it does not disturb me." That neutrality, so rare in the charged atmosphere, began to unsettle others in the room. The staff, the residents, the security, they all began to sense that there was something unusual about this janitor. He wasn't running. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't trying to appease the billionaire. He was simply there, and that simple fact made the tension in the room feel more complex, layered, and, in a strange way, controllable. No one yet knew that the janitor was about to do something completely unexpected, something that would alter the entire dynamic of the situation. But even before any words were spoken, his quiet presence had already begun to create a new kind of energy in the lobby. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but it was there, a small countercurrent to the billionaire's storm, an undercurrent of calm that hinted at the possibility that the situation could change, that perhaps the chaos did not have to continue, that maybe, just maybe, someone ordinary could shift the extraordinary tension that had gripped the room so completely. Then it happened. The janitor, who had been quietly sweeping and moving through the shadows of the lobby, paused. He set the broom gently against the polished floor, straightened, and, with the kind of calm that seemed almost impossible in that charged atmosphere, spoke. His voice was steady, clear, and confident, but the words themselves were not what stunned the room. It was the language he chose, fluent Arabic. The sound of it in the billionaire's ears was immediate, jarring, and electrifying. It sliced through the thick tension like a knife through fabric, sharp and precise, demanding attention and respect. The billionaire's body, which had been taut with fury, froze mid-step, caught in the sudden shock of recognition. For a brief, suspended moment, the lobby itself seemed to hold its breath. The thrum of anxiety that had filled every corner was replaced with a stunned silence, a collective pause as everyone tried to comprehend what had just happened. No one had expected this. The janitor, unassuming and overlooked, had chosen the perfect moment to step forward, not physically aggressive, not confrontational, but with a power that came purely from knowledge, from skill, from the ability to communicate in a way that no one in the room, except perhaps the billionaire, could fully understand. The words hung in the air, reverberating in the polished marble space, each syllable carrying weight far beyond its simple meaning. The billionaire's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face, which had been set in a rigid mask of anger, suddenly softened, not entirely, but enough to betray a moment of internal conflict. His brows furrowed, his eyes widened, and his jaw, which had been clenched so tightly it could have cracked, loosened just slightly. It was a pause born of surprise, of the sudden realization that this man, this janitor, whose presence had barely been noticed moments before, possessed something rare, something that demanded acknowledgement. His fury, which had seemed unstoppable, now hit an invisible wall. He could not advance, could not storm past, could not unleash the words he had prepared, because the unexpected intervention had shifted the balance in an instant. People in the lobby could feel it too. The energy that had dominated the room, thick and suffocating, was now punctured by a new force. Whispers began to circulate, subtle and incredulous. Did he just speak Arabic? How does he know that language? Why hasn't anyone noticed this before? Even those who had been closest to panic began to straighten, sensing that something unusual, perhaps even miraculous, was unfolding before their eyes. The janitor's calm command of the language had created a focal point, a pivot in the situation that drew attention away from fear and toward curiosity, recognition, and awe. The words themselves were carefully chosen. They were polite but firm, respectful yet unyielding, and carried an authority that belied the janitor's humble appearance. He did not shout. He did not plead. He simply communicated in a language that resonated with the billionaire's cultural and emotional understanding, a language that spoke to him in a way English could not. The fluency, the precision, the subtle mastery of tone and nuance, all of it combined to create a shockwave of comprehension and recognition in the billionaire's mind. He was confronted not with confrontation but with unexpected competence, a skill that commanded his attention, his respect, and, most importantly, his pause. In that moment, the dynamics of power shifted, though no one moved a muscle. The janitor had done something extraordinary without raising his voice, without threatening anyone, and without stepping beyond the boundaries of his role. He had simply spoken in a language that mattered, and in doing so, he had stopped a man who had seemed unstoppable. It was a rare and almost imperceptible demonstration of influence, a quiet assertion of presence that required no wealth, no title, no history of authority, only knowledge, courage, and perfect timing. The billionaire's freeze was total. His body was halfway toward the exit when the words hit him, halting him mid-motion. His hands, which had been poised to slam doors or wave away anyone in his path, hovered uncertainly. His posture, which had radiated dominance and aggression, now seemed tentative, as though he were weighing every next step with extreme caution. The room seemed to lean in, collectively holding itself in suspended anticipation, because everyone sensed that something monumental had occurred. The janitor's intervention was more than just a momentary pause. It was a revelation. It became clear that the interaction was no accident, no fluke. The billionaire's reaction, this complete halt in motion, the sudden hush in his expression, the flash of recognition in his eyes, showed that he understood the implications instantly. Someone in the room possessed a skill he had not anticipated, and that skill required acknowledgement. The fluency, the calm, the timing, it all combined to create a pause so profound that the air itself seemed to thicken around it. The billionaire froze, and in that instant, everything about him seemed to shift. It wasn't just the halt in his movement. It was a sudden recalibration of his entire presence, a subtle but profound transformation that left everyone watching in silent awe. His eyes, wide and alert, betrayed the storm that had been raging moments before, now replaced by something entirely different: confusion, surprise, and a grudging respect that was unfamiliar to him. Every muscle in his body, which had been coiled tight with anger, seemed to loosen just enough for awareness to seep in, allowing him to process the impossible. The janitor, an unassuming man who had been invisible until now, had spoken fluent Arabic, a language that commanded recognition in a way English or gestures never could. His mind raced even as his body remained motionless. He had stormed into the lobby with a single, unambiguous purpose: to leave, to express his anger, to assert dominance, to make sure that everyone in his path knew that his displeasure was not to be questioned or ignored. That plan, so carefully rehearsed in his mind, was suddenly interrupted by an element he had never anticipated. The janitor's words acted as a jolt, a sudden, electric shock to the system, forcing him to reconsider his assumptions about who held influence in this space. He could feel the shift, subtle but undeniable, and it unsettled him in a way that no amount of money, status, or force could immediately rectify. The reaction was visible even in the small details of his posture. His shoulders, which had been rigid with aggression, sagged slightly. His hands, previously clenched into fists, relaxed just enough to betray the internal recalibration taking place. The billionaire's gaze, which had been sharp and directed at the exit, now flickered back and forth between the janitor and the rest of the lobby. He was trying to understand, to decode this sudden and unexpected display of authority from someone he had not considered a participant in the hierarchy of power. It was a moment of cognitive dissonance. The world as he had known it, where anger commanded compliance and wealth demanded respect, suddenly seemed incomplete, fragile, and far more complicated than he had allowed himself to imagine. Even the subtle expressions in his face were telling. His eyes, once narrowed in fury, now widened with recognition and a hint of disbelief. His jaw, which had been clenched tight enough to hurt, loosened fractionally, a sign of the internal conflict brewing beneath the surface. His lips, which had been pressed into a thin, rigid line, now trembled slightly, caught between the urge to respond with force and the surprising realization that this man, this janitor, had altered the balance of the room with nothing more than his words. The juxtaposition of his former aggression and his current state of stunned stillness created a tension that was almost palpable, a taut wire stretching between fury and comprehension. Inside his mind, the billionaire began replaying the events, almost in slow motion, analyzing every detail. How had he not noticed this man before? How could someone so ordinary in appearance wield such influence simply by speaking a language fluently? He realized that the words themselves were not the full measure of the impact. It was the timing, the tone, the confidence with which they were delivered. This was not fear or intimidation. It was presence, authority, and a command of communication that transcended the usual hierarchies of wealth and power. For the first time in what felt like years, the billionaire was confronted with a form of power that did not come from money, title, or status, and it unsettled him deeply. He became aware of the reactions around him, the subtle shifts in the people who had been his audience moments before. Staff, residents, and security personnel were watching the janitor with a mixture of awe and disbelief, their own tension momentarily replaced with curiosity. And in seeing them, the billionaire realized that the room itself had changed. The energy that had been charged with fear and submission was now tinged with a new force, one that acknowledged competence, calm, and unexpected mastery. The awareness of this shift added another layer to his own reaction, complicating the initial clarity of his anger with the realization that he was no longer in total control of the room or the narrative. Even his instincts, finely honed over years of commanding respect and attention, were challenged. He could feel a natural urge to assert dominance, to demand obedience, to reclaim the space with his presence and fury. But something in the janitor's demeanor, in the calm precision of his speech, in the unexpected fluency and authority of his words, made that instinct pause, hesitate, and reconsider. The billionaire's mind, accustomed to immediate compliance, now had to navigate uncertainty, and that uncertainty was unfamiliar, uncomfortable, and profoundly compelling. The moment of recognition between the billionaire and the janitor changed everything in the lobby. The tension that had gripped every person in the room seemed to loosen, as if a pressure valve had been released, though nothing had physically moved yet. The billionaire's eyes remained locked on the janitor, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, his breathing slowed, becoming more deliberate, more controlled. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible at first, but those who had been watching closely could sense the invisible ripple spreading outward, touching everyone in the space. The room, which had been saturated with fear, uncertainty, and anticipation, now held a different energy, one of cautious curiosity, tempered by awe at what had just occurred. The connection forged in those few words of fluent Arabic was extraordinary not only because it stopped a man known for his anger, but because it created a bridge across social, cultural, and hierarchical divides that had seemed insurmountable just moments before. Here was a man who had stormed in with wealth, influence, and authority, and here was a man whose uniform and tools marked him as ordinary, whose work usually went unnoticed, and yet he had established a form of respect that no amount of money could command. The dynamics of the room had shifted. It was no longer simply about who had power or who could assert it. It was about acknowledgement, recognition, and the subtle but undeniable force of personal competence. The billionaire's body, once tense and coiled with aggression, began to relax incrementally. His fists unclenched slowly, and the rigidity in his shoulders softened. Every inch of his posture, previously brimming with fury, now carried hesitation, as if he were reconsidering not just his next words, but his next actions. For the first time, he seemed human to those watching, not an untouchable force of anger, but a man capable of pause, capable of surprise, capable of recognition. And as he paused, the janitor maintained his calm composure, his presence steady and unshaken, reinforcing the unspoken truth that this interaction was no accident, no chance occurrence. People in the lobby could feel the subtle change as if the air itself had shifted. Conversations, previously halted by tension, began to murmur again, cautiously, as though acknowledging that a new equilibrium had been established. The residents, who had been silently holding their breath, noticed that the billionaire no longer radiated threat. Staff who had been rigid and defensive relaxed their stance, their own tension easing in response to the unspoken dialogue unfolding between the two men. Even security personnel, trained to respond to unpredictable and dangerous situations, allowed themselves a fraction of relief. The interaction had created a safe space, a momentary suspension of conflict brought about not by coercion or force, but by understanding and connection. The billionaire's gaze softened in a way that surprised even him. The realization that someone who had been invisible, someone whose work was often overlooked, could possess a skill so profound shook him to the core. It was not just the language itself, it was the way the janitor had spoken it, calmly, confidently, without arrogance or threat, and yet with undeniable authority. In that instant, the billionaire recognized that this man's worth could not be measured by appearance, title, or status. It was a humbling revelation, and it began to change his perspective, subtly, almost imperceptibly, on the hierarchy he had always relied upon. A shift occurred in the room that went beyond the two men. Observers began to internalize what they were witnessing. The lesson was clear. Power and influence do not always reside where we expect them. Sometimes, they live in quiet competence, in unshakable calm, in the ability to act with precision at the perfect moment. The janitor, previously overlooked, had established a connection that had disarmed a man who seemed unstoppable, teaching a lesson in humility, awareness, and the unexpected ways authority can manifest. The billionaire's voice, when he finally spoke, was measured, quiet, and deliberate, unlike the booming fury that had filled the room moments before. His words, restrained and controlled, reflected not only the surprise of being stopped in his tracks, but also the recognition of a skill that commanded respect. Every listener could sense the subtle deference in his tone, the acknowledgement that the balance of power had shifted, even if only temporarily. The tension, once suffocating, began to dissolve, replaced by a cautious calm that allowed the room to breathe again. It became evident that the connection forged in that moment went beyond language or circumstance. It was a recognition of presence, of humanity, of the power that comes from calm authority in the face of chaos. The janitor, through a single act of skill and courage, had transformed the energy in the room, defusing a situation that had seemed on the brink of explosive conflict. The billionaire, who had entered with anger and intent to leave, was now forced to reckon with an unexpected lesson, that influence and respect are not always earned through wealth or intimidation, but through knowledge, timing, and the quiet assertion of competence.